On this week's CRO Connected podcast, we're talking to none other than JD Miller. Here's the TLDL for those of you that don't have time to listen to the whole episode. Great CROs don't just sell. They build predictable revenue systems that align with the private equity investment thesis, and increasingly, they're using AI to do the analysis while focusing their own time on the human side of leadership and selling. On this week's episode of the CRO Connected podcast, I'm joined by JD Miller, operating partner at Rothschild & Co, and a long-time revenue leader who has spent much of his career operating inside private equity-backed technology companies. JD is a multi-time chief revenue officer who's been through several successful exits and now works closely with private equity investors and their portfolio companies, advising and coaching CROs on how to scale revenue organizations and prepare businesses for exit. Along the way, he's also become a recognized voice on the evolving CRO role, particularly in the context of private equity. And he's the author of the CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity. He also has a new book coming out looking at how artificial intelligence is reshaping sales organizations and revenue leadership. In this conversation, we talk about what really changes when a company moves from venture-backed growth into private equity ownership, why the CRO role shifts from individual heroics to building a repeatable revenue system, and how leaders can align their go-to-market strategy with the investment thesis driving the business. We'll also explore the impact AI is beginning to have across the revenue organization, from planning and forecasting through to sales execution, and why, despite all the technology, the fundamentally human elements of selling remain as important as ever. So if you're a CRO or a senior go-to-market leader navigating growth, investors, and increasingly complex revenue organizations, this is a conversation you'll definitely want to stick around for. Let's get into it. So JD, welcome to the show. It's an absolute delight to have you here with me today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited about what we're going to be talking about today, because there's a lot of stuff that you've written about in the past. I know you've got the new book coming out, and also there's a lot of stuff going on in the world at the moment with AI, and I think we're going to cover all of those topics today. Before we do that, though, and I don't know how many of our audience know you already, but I'd love to get a little bit of a background on you. How did you end up where you are?
Well, it certainly was being in the right place at the right time. I went to college assuming that I was going to be a lawyer. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, where you either became a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer. And after a series of events, including an internship in the Clinton White House, I decided
Wow.
that law school wasn't it for me. And so I looked back at my undergraduate degree, and I had a great pre-law curriculum of philosophy, comparative literature, and public speaking. And I was like,
Okay.
well, I'm not going to be a professional philosopher, and I'm not going to be a professional literature comparer. So what can you do with a communication degree? And the university didn't know either, but they said, why don't you join a research lab where we were studying group memory and how communities, form in the physical world. It was the late 90s when the internet was just starting. And so we were also researching how do groups form online. And that just led into a job at a small.com that continued to path on. And so over those years, I've now been sort of focused in on B2B SaaS sales, always backed by private equity. I've been through 5 exits, and today I work in private equity as a CRO advisor or go-to-market advisor for our portfolio of companies.
So with all those exits, and you've been in the CRO seat a number of times yourselves, what does that teach you about revenue leadership and that most CROs don't actually realize early in their careers? What do you think that is?
I think for people like me who've grown up through the sales organization, they tend to think it's about being the superhero seller. A lot of times frontline managers, the first time they've moved from being a quota carrier to managing a team, they think it means, oh, now I just have 8 sellers who are going to bring deals to
Right.
me to close. actually, the higher up you get in the organization, and then especially, when you start having, board relationships and different investors, it's not about you personally going and doing any sales. It's
Mm,
really about implementing a repeatable process in a machine that you can have, armies of salespeople teach them how to do the same things. And this is where, the communication scholar in me says,
mm.
groups do make decisions in predictable ways. So we can teach 200 sellers, the tactics, the strategies, the way to engage and get big results.
I love that. It's that whole idea of moving from individual heroics to systemic thinking, and I'm sure we're going to touch on that later on when in the interview. Um, Listen, I'm really curious to know what it is about people that make it to CRO, because they start off, as you say, as those individual contributors, and they do, and I've seen it before, they do sort of follow that sort of spiral whereby they're like, I have to be the hero, so on and so forth. What is it though that really clicks in somebody's career when they suddenly realize it is the shift from selling to that whole revenue machine piece? What do you think makes it click?
I'm not sure what makes it click for people, but I do think that getting comfortable with making that change at every promotion is really important. As a social scientist, and actually I think a lot about our dog that we just got. We train our dog to do things. And so she's learned really quickly. I do this thing, I get a reward. People are the same way. That, as you start as a seller, I do the heroics, I get a big check, I get rewarded for that. Um, and so it's natural that we want to keep repeating the same things that got us rewarded previously. Unfortunately, what happens is the things that you do to be a great seller that used to get you those rewards are the opposite of things that are going to make you a great manager.
Mm,
Because as a great seller, the spotlight's on me. I'm waiting until the last minute and bringing the big surprise deal in that saves the day. As a manager, we want the total opposite of that. We want you
yeah.
empowering your team, the spotlight on them, and so on and so forth. And then I think we see the same things with companies that if you've been the head of sales for a company that's maybe $10 million in revenue,
Hmm.
the things that you're doing there are totally different than the things you're going to do when you're $50 million in revenue, when you don't have the bandwidth to know every single customer. And so
Mm,
again we say, I used to reward you for delivering amazing customer service and really knowing the product really, really well. Now you're 50 million in revenue. I want you to delegate that to someone else, and I want to reward you for the strategic thinking of, how do we hire the next 200 people? And so I'm not sure what makes it click in people's minds, but I definitely see that the people whose careers continue to progress are the ones who are constantly able to say goodbye to the thing that used to get them a reward and now start doing something else.
yeah. The other thing I noticed though is that there's a massive transition in thinking when people realize there's a difference between management and leadership.
Yes.
And do you see that having an impact on how people operate?
Yeah, I love that perspective. And I like that on a couple of different levels. When you're thinking about your audience that's sitting in the CRO seat, maybe you're backed by private equity and you've got a
Mm,
team of 150, 200 people. Um, it is physically impossible for you to micromanage every moment of the deals, but people are definitely looking to you to be the inspirational leader that gets people excited about you know painting the vision of where you're going and getting everyone moving there. But you don't need to be the CRO of a giant company to be a leader. I also see
no.
individual contributors on teams who are still chasing the quota every day, but they are also that inspirational, great colleague who shares best practices with their peers. And I think those are the folks that then get promoted up into management roles where it is about inspection,
Mm.
and then, continue the path.
I think there's a similar sort of evolution for the companies themselves, though, because I suspect that, and it'd be great to get your view on this. That what do you find is the difference then as people are moving from that whole individual contributor to manager to leader? The company's growing as well, and it's maybe been, initial seed funding to VC funding to now we're suddenly with private equity. How does that transition from ownership structure point of view impact on how people need to think?
Yeah. it is about taking that journey, I love the words you used, from heroics to, systemic. When I think about a founder, and I've never been a company founder myself, those are really smart, talented people. But when you've got a great idea and you've got no customers, the way you're going to start winning is really all on the strength of your personality and the strength of your vision and your ability to go promise people. I understand your industry really well. I'm going to go build this product for you. If it goes wrong, you call me.
Yeah.
That will scale to about $10 million in revenue in tech
Hmm.
sales. And then all of a sudden, not everyone can know the founder. And so the founder has to hire maybe their first sales people. It's certainly, start thinking about professional sales management. And all of a sudden, you've got a brand new 23-year-old seller who doesn't come from the industry, doesn't develop the product. And you need to take the knowledge out of the founder's head and put it in that 23-year-old's mouth who can say it and repeat it and keep getting results. And then when you do really well with that, and you're at 40 million in revenue, 50 million in revenue, you go from a handful of sellers who are still all in the same office with that founder to now we've got national coverage. And now I've got people across the country or across the world that need to be able to do that as well. And so now that leader, is definitely not about coaching the seller and being in the customer deal. Maybe the
Hmm.
largest deal of the year, some of those, but now it really is all about having a system that you can drop anyone in, teach them to do the work.
Yeah.
And the founder has to kind of double down on their, forward-looking vision of, where is the next thing going to happen in the industry? How do I start painting the picture for the next product or the next sets of products? And then finally, that founder becomes all about money. Like we've got, we are going to go build these new products, and I've got to go fundraise, and I've got to go inspire people to, invest in my company. And so it really takes a unique person to be able to keep, you know, you say wear multiple hats, but it's actually keep changing the hat
Yeah.
from one to the next through all of those ages and stages.
It's almost like an evolution because you go from being the founder to then operationally being the chief executive to then maybe as you start to expand the team and your passion is for the product, your passion is for the sector you're in, and as you rightly say, for the fundraising piece, you've also got to become the chief evangelist.
Yes. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think it's a rare person who can make that change. I know for myself, I specialize in a very particular phase of growth. I've been a CRO multiple times, but it's always taken companies from, $50 million in revenue to maybe 300 million in revenue. And there's a certain way to do that. And I have a process and a playbook. I wrote a book on how to do that. Um, but when we get to the exit, part of the reason you hear me say I've been through 5 exits is I didn't stay with that company for the next journey. I got to the 300 and I said,
Yeah.
maybe I don't know how to do the public company thing, or I don't want to do that. Let me go back and repeat the thing that I'm really good at. And that means, go back to another company that's just gotten private equity investment and take them on that journey and do that over and over and over again.
That's great. So I want to just change the tack a little bit because we've talked a lot about, the private equity investment piece. Now, one of the things I'm curious about is when you suddenly have private equity investor, what happens in terms of how you now as a revenue leader, as a CRO, have to work within that paradigm? Because it is different.
It is different. So, I always use this analogy that private equity is sort of like house flipping. You find a company that's got good, strong bones, the same way you go find a house that's got, some good, strong character, but maybe the kitchen's a little bit broken or maybe the living room's looking a little bit dated. And the same way a house flipper comes in and says, I'm going to put a fresh coat of paint on that, or I'm going to replace the plumbing or replace the roof. Private equity comes with a very specific investment thesis that
Yeah.
says, here's this company, it's doing really well. To make it, get to the next evolution, here's what we think is going to happen. Sometimes that's about, efficiency of processes. Sometimes that's about just pouring more money into the sales and marketing engine and doing it 2 and 3 and 4 times as big. Sometimes it's about, new product development or, cost efficiencies or it's all of those things. Um, as an executive who's in one of those companies, when private equity comes along, it's very important to know what that investment thesis is, because
Mm,
it's very easy for people to say, Well, I just don't know why they don't give me 3 times my marketing budget, because I would love to go run a team that's 3 times as big. If the investment thesis wasn't about that, you're really in the wrong place. So really understanding what is the investment thesis, and then how does my role as the revenue leader support that? And then, with that house flipping, we're going to get to a sale in usually 4 or 5 years. So, really being clear on what are those 16 to 20 quarters that I'm leading through.
Hmm.
The sad reality is a lot of CROs only last 18 months. And
Yes.
I think it's because they don't know how to talk to the board, or they don't know how to talk to their investor about where are we on that journey. And so, that's, I think, the key skill is really understanding what the thesis is, understanding my role, and then being able to report progress on it.
I think that's super interesting, and I do want to unpack that a little bit more because, especially with the investment thesis piece, if you are sitting there, and let's take your analogy of the house build, and we're going to flip the house. So I come in, I'm the investor, and I go, do you know what? Needs a new kitchen, a new bathroom. We're going to strip those things out, and we're going to do those. Yeah, I'm the tenant in effect. I'm the CRO, and I go, well, I don't agree with that. I'm just going to carry on. I want to paint the living room,
Right.
and off I go, and I keep on doing that. And in this analogy, the painting the living room is effectively the CRO is carrying on just chasing whatever revenue is available, rather than maybe my investment thesis doesn't say that. Would
Hmm.
that be a typical scenario?
I think that's exactly right. And this is again that thing about change. I've been painting a beautiful living room, and look at how great that house is. That's why it attracted you in the first place. Um, at the end of the day, the investor is the ultimate boss, and that's
Yeah.
the board. And so, if you can't get on board with knowing what they think is going to add the most value, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. I also
Now,
think sometimes. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, no, please carry on.
So I also think sometimes people look at this tenure of sales leaders who are getting turned over in private equity quickly, and they think it's because they're missing the number. And I always say, eventually, if you're missing the number, that's going to be a problem. But more often, again, keeping on this house analogy, we knew the kitchen had a leaky faucet. We're not expecting it to be watertight right now. What we really want you to do is tell me, how long is it going to take to replace the plumbing? And,
Mhm.
and maybe we're not going to put the fanciest faucet in, maybe we're going to do something sort of middling there. So I think a lot of times these CROs are not getting fired for missing the number. I think they're getting fired for not setting the right expectations. And so, private equity CROs, especially, it's all about building a skill set of communicating with your board as much as it is a skill set of go running a sales team.
So is it though just about setting the expectation, or is it about setting the expectation and having a plan to back it up?
Yes. Well, if you set an expectation that you can't deliver, you're going to get
Well,
in a lot
but
of
we've seen
trouble.
that before.
We have seen that before. And I've also actually seen CROs who, make a promise and actually deliver the number, but the board has no idea how they got there, and everyone's kind of biting their nails saying like, "Oh, I don't really like this roller coaster." And those are CROs that get replaced too, because everyone wants comfort, stability, like what are we doing? What's this week, this month, next quarter, next year? And if we can all kind of hold hands and agree on the journey, it might not be a very pretty journey together, but as long as we all know where we are and we agree, those are the CROs that have a lot of longevity.
I think I've just worked out why you've had such a successful career. It goes back to your original sort of degree. It's communication, communication, communication. Set the expectation, communicate how you're going to do it, keep on communicating, make sure everybody's in the loop. I think that's kind of the point that we're driving to. You've got to keep people on board, and you've got to set those expectations and maintain that expectation. I think that's what you're trying to say.
It is. And that's actually, what my first book, The CRO's Guide to Winning, is all about. It's a set of templates and processes that you can just rip out of the book and start, sending emails to your board today to help with that communication process.
Tell me a bit more about that book.
So, after having been a CRO multiple times myself and then making a career shift to working for the private equity firm, we have a portfolio of 36 companies. And I get to be the guy, who works with the board and works with the CROs and says, I've been in your seat. Let me help you succeed here. And I realized that I kept giving our CROs the same kind of coaching. Oh, it's your first time ever being owned by private equity. Here's a really good reporting template that you can use on on a weekly basis. Here's a really good process you can use to make sure you're hiring the talent you need. Here's a good process you can use to set next year's annual plan in a way that everyone's gonna back up on it. And I realized I had a couple of dozen templates that I just kept pulling out over and over and over again. And I realized, you know, you don't have to come be a company owned by Five Arrows to get that. And I'll scale
Yeah.
much bigger if I can just like give it to you in a book. And then hopefully the next CROs we start, investing in show up already doing that stuff. And we can start doing, the more sophisticated levels of engagement.
Now, when we spoke previously, you said something that I thought was incredibly interesting, and that was that a lot of CROs are sometimes a little bit fearful of the private equity partners, the operating partners coming into their businesses, and how that relationship sort of develops. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's something I find incredibly interesting.
Yeah. So this again comes back to all of that social science, humanities stuff. I talk a lot about the intersection of business, technology, and humanity. And I think a lot of times when we see humanity and our business lives coming together, it really means vulnerability. And a
Mm,
lot of people do not want to be vulnerable and admit their flaws. So again,
yeah.
I know we're overusing this house analogy, but my natural tendency is to say, come on into the house and I'm going to try and hide the fact that I've got a really leaky kitchen faucet. Private equity knows your faucet is leaking, and actually, I, as the operating advisor who aligns with you, I'm like
Yeah.
the kitchen guy who's supposed to help you, through that journey.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes we get CROs who are like, "Oh, that's JD. He's from the board. He's from the investors. I don't want to tell him that, we're really struggling in this region, or I don't want to tell him because he'll go tell someone else and I'll get in trouble." That's not what your investors want. Your investors know things are broken. They just want to hear, what is it about the brokenness? How much is it going to cost to fix? How long is it going to take to fix? And we'll back you the whole way there. So I think if you're a CRO and you've got a board member talking to you, or you've got, you work for a PE firm that has an advisor like me who aligns with you, make use of us because we're going to help ease those conversations and really make your life easier even when the news is kind of ugly.
I love that. I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I think any sort of revenue leader can learn is the board ultimately can really be your friend. It's about how you use those relationships and embrace them. So that's a fantastic piece of advice.
I
One of the
love
things that,
that.
sorry,
Oh,
go on.
sorry.
No, no.
So I love that we use this word forecasting, and it makes me think a lot about the weather reporter. The person on my news every morning who delivers my weather forecast isn't in trouble when he says it's going to rain today. He actually does a great, it's not his fault. He does a really good job and he's rewarded when he says it's going to rain. I pull out my umbrella. He tells me I'm going to need my umbrella for 3 hours and then I can put it away. And that's the same kind of communication when we talk about sales forecasts and board forecasts is
Mm.
you're not going to get in trouble because it's not a pleasant bit of news. You're going to get in trouble when you don't tell me how to deal with the pleasant news.
So what immediate guidance and advice might you give a CRO who is trying to hit their number and realizes that the system within which they're working isn't capable of hitting the number?
Yeah. Communicate it right now, pick up the phone and tell somebody. And then the next step is not to just say we're not going to make our number, but very quickly get to the explanation and diagnosis of the problem. What's going wrong? Why is it? I'm a big fan. I talk about sales velocity metrics all the time. it's
Yep.
it's like my favorite calculation. So it's, do we have enough deals? Are the deals average size the right size? Are we winning the right amount? And how long is it taking us to win? And ultimately, that adds up to I'm making the number or I'm not. But if I'm not making the number, there's a lot of reasons. I might not have enough opportunity. I might have a ton of opportunity, but they're really small deals and they're not as big as we thought. I might not win them as well, or I might win them and it takes me forever. So if you can really quickly articulate just that basic math, you're already far down the path to, having a plan that
Mm.
people are confident in. And then hopefully, next year when it comes around to annual planning time, we can sit down and be pretty sophisticated about, what are all the elements of next year's plan. Can I really sign off that I think each of those, customer churn is going to be this number, price increases are going to be this number, new logo wins are going to be this number. And if I can, layer that on the message and keep everyone on that journey with me, we're going to have a lot of success.
I know that's something you've advocated for incredibly heavily in your first book, The CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity, where you talk about, the idea of data-driven planning as a mantra and something that's a real anchor for any revenue leader to really think about very, very hard.
Yeah. And I think that's often, in my own journey, when I was a 24-year-old quota carrier, you know, I didn't really get that. I hoped for the best. And I was working for a company that had a great product. We were selling the internet in 2001. And my pitch was, I'm calling from the internet. Do you need a website? Well,
I
you know
love
what? A
that.
lot of people needed big airlines never needed their first website. So I didn't realize, all of that. But my strategy was just kind of like, I'm working really hard. I hope I'm praying about it, and the money comes. Later in life, I learned, oh, you actually have to be thoughtful about this and have a plan and be more strategic. And if you can communicate that with other people, it gets everyone on your team and rowing in the right direction.
No, fantastic. Now, one of the things that you mentioned a few minutes ago was you said one of the things that we need to look at is how costs start accumulating within the business and how you can maybe lower those costs. I know that you've described AI in the past as being the new lowest cost resource on the team. Maybe you
Yeah.
can talk a little bit to that and how you see CROs, revenue teams leveraging AI today.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I think about a business mentor I had when I first started managing people. And he said to me this thing about, the things that you used to do really well. You're higher up in the organization, you're making more money. Don't keep going and doing those things. Delegate everything you can to whoever the lowest cost resource is that's capable of doing the job completely and effectively. And so, in sales organizations, we know what this looks like. This is the college interns who are doing, list
Mm.
building for us. These are the BDRs and the SDRs that are doing all that routine, you know, outreach emails. And now it takes like 15, 17 touches to get someone to take a call with you. And so those have always been our lowest cost resources. Well, today, I think as people are starting to experiment with AI and it's really becoming part of the business, that is the new ultimate lowest cost resource that can generate a list, do prospect research, send emails on mass scale, in the RevOps function, pull together an accurate forecast for you, inspect your contract, do a lot of these things. But I think the other half of the conversation is really important. Is it's not just that they're the lowest cost resource, but it also has to be who can do it effectively and correctly. And so, yes, AI is going to be great at finding out all the information about your company and feeding me, getting me ready for my
Mm.
call, and do that in 2 minutes when it would have taken me 2 hours. It's not going to be so effective at picking up the phone, building trust with you, having perspective taking, organizing and orchestrating group decision making.
Hmm.
So I think the best organizations and the best sellers are the ones who are looking at AI tools and saying, how can I use them to get rid of the drudgery so that I can focus on the uniquely human things that only I can do. And that's really where my value is going to be.
There's a danger, though, isn't there, that some organizations get a bit overly happy with the whole AI piece. And to your point, 15 to 17 touches before I pick up the phone. If I'm leaving a lot of those touches to AI, I end up with a lot of AI slop in there
Hmm.
And actually it can be brand damaging. And I have to say, from my own perspective, I simply don't understand why somebody wouldn't just pick up the phone in the first place. That's a different conversation for another day. But again, it's what sort of advice would you give to people about the overuse of AI? I know you've talked about the uniquely human pieces that we are best built to do, but there is that temptation, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate your point on that AI slop, because I remember when I first started selling, it used to be three touches. If I call and I left you three voicemails and you didn't call back, you heard my message, you decided you weren't interested and you were done. And then all of a sudden we knew how to do mail merge. And so then it was like, 10 emails and phone calls to cut through the noise. And now it's 17 touches. And I do think with AI bots, out on LinkedIn, there's so much noise, it's going to be dozens and dozens or hundreds of things. Um, I always talk about those uniquely human connections because I really think it's going to bring us back to interpersonal connection. I had a vendor that, is now hosting 7-person dinners, little salon dinners in cities
Hmm.
that they're really bringing people together to have true, genuine, authentic conversations. They're using AI to help them figure out who are the best prospects that should be at that dinner. They're
Hmm.
using AI to help them figure out, what is the unique thing that's going to drive that person to say yes. So when I pick up the phone or knock on your door, you're likely to come. And they're absolutely prepping everyone before they walk into that dinner to say, here's what you need to know about the business, what happened in their business, maybe some things that you've shared publicly about family, so you can really engage correctly. But I think the best businesses are the ones who are going to figure out how to use AI, not to just do more, but to do more quality work. And that might even be less work, higher quality.
Yeah, I think the way you've sort of described that, it's like it's AI augmenting the jobs to be done, but it's not replacing human trust and relationship building.
Yeah. So, in this new book, I lay out a 3-level framework about how people are going to use AI or how people might start down the journey of AI. We're sitting here in early 26. It was only 6 months ago that a survey came out that said 61% of American workers, have not touched AI yet. So
Hmm.
even though we get to have all these cool conversations about, what is AI, vast majority of workers still haven't even touched it. So a lot of organizations are going to have this kind of level one, just experimentation. How can I get you to log into ChatGPT or Gemini, or just start to get a little bit of literacy about how these tools are? Now, I think that window is rapidly closing, and that 61%, pretty soon we'll see most workers have done some of that
Yeah.
experimentation. The next level is really the things we're talking about. Where are these, applications that maybe it's new features on apps that are already in my sales process, my CRM system, or different things, or maybe it's a new piece of technology that's purpose built for something, and how do we start using that to augment humanity? Kind of the third level, which I think is still very visionary, a lot of people talk about truly agentic AI. And
Yes.
they're like, look at this capability. I can have an AI engine synthesize my voice and make calls on my behalf that sound like me and carry on conversations. I think there are some organizations that are maybe doing that. I personally don't think we're ever all going to get there where the bots are talking to the bots and your AI is buying from my AI. I think we're probably going to sit in that, kind of comfortable middle where, just like the internet, we heard these stories 25 years ago when websites started coming out, didn't get rid of everyone's jobs, changed the way we did the jobs, made us relate to each other differently, but there's always room for the human in the seat.
Yeah, I know you spend a lot of time in London. There used to be a program, a television program, on the BBC called Tomorrow's World in sort of the 80s and early 90s. If half of that stuff had come to pass by now, do you know what I mean? And there's always this idea that, oh, that might be interesting. Still waiting for the flying cars, but that's another conversation again. Um, so I think we're safe to say AI is not going to be replacing sellers anytime soon. However, there are things that we can leverage. And as you've said, I mean, just to remind our audience, what is the title of your new book?
So it's called the AI Handbook for Sales Professionals. And it really looks, each chapter is a different kind of sales professional. BDR, SDR, quota carrier, frontline manager, CRO, board member, executive.
Wow.
Uh, and so, here's again the researcher in me. I went and I looked at 158 different AI tools for sales and really laid out, who is the person this is designed for? What are the processes that it's supposed to
Mm.
support? And it's probably not a book you're going to read cover to cover. It's a handbook because you can flip
Yeah.
to, what does it mean to be a frontline manager who's hiring somebody? Where does AI potentially play a role in that? And who are some of the vendors that I might consider?
So we're getting on to the future of the CRO. I think this is a nice way to segue into this because clearly AI is going to change how CROs do their work. What would you say then the skill sets are that a CRO of tomorrow is going to have to master?
So I think even more than today, it's really about data literacy.
Mm.
AI is very good at pattern matching, and we think AI is this brand new thing. We've had AI since the 70s. It started with the basic word processing of, I misspelled this word and the pattern was wrong, and it suggested what I meant. Now you start texting someone and it suggests what it thinks the rest of your sentence is going to be. The cool thing about ChatGPT is just more of that pattern matching, that it's ingested reams and reams of data and it can predict that when I say I'm having a really bad day, it says, "Oh, I'm so sorry you're feeling that way," blah 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 blah. But for the CRO, AI tools and their pattern matching capabilities mean we can actually consume all kinds of structured and unstructured data, all of the history of your documents and your prices. And I'm in tech, all of your customers and their users and how frequently they're using which features of your product, and then all of the unstructured, call recordings and transcripts. So we're not going to struggle from a lack of data, and we're not going to struggle with a lack of ability to process the data. The CRO of the future is the one who's really going to say, okay, because AI can analyze all of this in 10 minutes, I need to be really good at knowing what questions I want to ask, knowing what business problems I want to solve, what data sources do I think might inform that. And then, the analysis piece will go really, really quickly. And then it becomes, so now, you know, structurally, strategically, what do I want to do with the results I found? And how can I continue to evolve the business?
Now, I've got one final question for you, JD,
Okay.
because you've worked with CROs across dozens of companies. What's the one mistake that you see being made most often, and what would you counsel people to do to avoid falling into the trap?
I think the one bit of advice is what we've talked about with being vulnerable, particularly in a PE environment, but I suspect it's true if you're, running a public company or if you're running a privately held company that has one investor. It's not about shying away from the bad news. It's really about, you don't need to have the superhero cape on. It's really about being the really good weather forecaster that says, it's a good day, it's a bad day, but here's how we're going to get through it. And here's the umbrella that I'm offering you to help you along the path.
JD Miller, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been excellent to have you on the show. Thanks for
Thanks
joining.
for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, that was a super interesting conversation with JD. I really enjoyed that, and I have a number of takeaways from it. First, the role of the CRO changes dramatically once private equity enters the picture. As JD explained, private equity investors come in with a clear investment thesis, a specific plan for how the business is going to create value, and ultimately how they're going to exit that investment. The job of the revenue leader is not simply to chase whatever revenue is available, but to ensure that the go-to-market strategy is aligned with that thesis. Second, scaling companies require a shift from individual heroics to repeatable systems. Many CROs grow up as great sellers, but as organizations move from 10 million to 50 million and beyond, success increasingly comes from building a machine that can deliver predictable revenue rather than relying on individual relationships. Third, AI is beginning to play a significant role in how revenue organizations operate. JD described AI as the new lowest cost resource on the team. It's capable of handling tasks like research, forecasting, data analysis, and preparation for board meetings. But importantly, it doesn't replace the human side of selling. Trust, relationships, and consensus building remain fundamental to how complex B2B deals get done. And finally, the best CROs recognize that success in investor-backed companies, it's not always about having the right answers. It is about being transparent about what's happening in the business and being able to clearly forecast what comes next. As JD put it, great CROs behave less like superheroes and more like excellent weather forecasters, helping the board understand what's coming and how the business will navigate it. Thanks again for joining JD and myself on this week's podcast. For those of you listening, if you've enjoyed the conversation, please remember to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks again and have a great week.